Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the El Paraiso Red Plum Processed Colombia from Nomad Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Nomad, based out of Barcelona, Spain, and if ever such a thing as an unofficial review existed, then this is it right here, as there's a pretty long backstory behind this coffee, so let me try to run through it as quickly as possible. And it begins when Nomad was a suggestion to us by Christopher. So once again, shout out to and thank you to Christopher for the suggestion. So we actually went and reviewed 3 of Nomad's coffees, none of which I was necessarily the biggest fan of. However, what I kept hearing from so many people was that this Red Plum coffee was a very special and exceptional coffee. I mean, it is their competition series coffee. So I made a point of it to try to find this coffee and review this coffee. I even went out and spoke to a local coffee shop owner that was going to start carrying Nomad's coffees. I said to him, hey, next time you make a purchase, can you add a bag of this Red Plum coffee and I will happily pay for it? And he agreed. However, by the time he went and made the purchase, this coffee had actually been discontinued from Nomad's website. So I kind of assumed I wasn't going to get an opportunity to review this coffee, at least not this time around. However, fast forward a couple of months later, and I was speaking to somebody that's pretty well connected in the coffee world, and he happened to mention that he still had most of this bag left over. So I said to him, hey, if you don't mind, can you go ahead and send it over? I honestly just wanted to try this coffee for myself and get an impression of the coffee that people had been speaking so highly of. And I didn't initially plan on reviewing it as a result. However, I think that this coffee is actually quite worth discussing. So for those reasons and the fact that this coffee is quite out of roast state, I'm going to consider this to be somewhat of an unofficial review. But I'm very much looking forward to discussing this coffee. I felt it was worth discussing at the very least. So today right here is day 83 of this coffee. And Nomad does have a brew guide on their website. It is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, 205 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this coffee a little bit more concentrated. That could obviously have been that it was quite out of roast state, so I went with a 16:1. And I liked it better through the V60, which would indicate a more medium fine grind. However, today I brewed it for the first time through the AeroPress, and I actually quite like it through the AeroPress, so I might say AeroPress is best for this coffee, at least in this sense, this out of roast state. Nomad is a European light for the roast profile, and with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. So day 73, as you can see, already way out of roast state. First time trying it, and the first impression I had was that it was quite flavorful. So it had so much more intensity than I think I was expecting, especially for a coffee this far out of roast state. And I believe one of the flavor notes they have listed on here is a carnival apple, and I don't know exactly what that entails in Europe or in Spain anyway, but over here we'd probably consider that to be a caramel apple. And I could see that because it's an interesting note. It's a more sugary apple in that sense. In fact, it's quite sweet, and the cup in general is both pretty clean and sweet, so those are 2 really positive starts that you can have for a cup of coffee. Love cleanliness, love sweetness, so positive. Day 73 ran into the Chemex, and it was quite as enjoyable, almost as enjoyable through the Chemex as well. Has not lost any vibrancy in the cup. It's still quite flavorful, and was seeing even more of the cleaner side of those red fruits, and just made for a great overall cup. So I believe the flavor notes they have listed on here: carnival apple, strawberry lollipop, and raspberry. And the red berry side of things, it's a very clean red berry, so I think that's something that's worth noting. It's also a sugary red berry as well. There's so much sugariness in this cup of coffee, candy sugariness in general. So those were the first initial takeaways I had. Day 77 adjusted to Nomad's recipe, and it still maintains so much of its clean sweetness, but as I kind of mentioned, it's a little bit more diluted of a recipe, a 17 versus a 16:1, and lots of sugariness in the cup yet again. Red hard candy, even brown candy, and just candied sweetness all around. Quite a bit of a lasting sugary finish to the cup of coffee. So yeah, still positive. I just prefer a little bit more concentration because obviously so far out of roast state, I just needed the coffee to be intensified a little bit. Day 79, Nomad's recipe through the Chemex this time, and it feels slightly better at the more concentrated recipe, something I've been alluding to up to this point. Pretty wild and clean, continues to radiate sweet, sugary, apple-like components to this cup. You can see sugary but clean red fruits as well. So once again, another nice day of this cup of coffee. And I just kind of went back to the recipe that worked best for me, which was the V60. I mean, we're not going to see any change from this coffee. It's already so far into its roast state that the only change we're going to see is maybe a loss of vibrancy in general. And yeah, quite nice still. No change into the coffee this far into the roast state. Pretty straightforward candied apple, sugary red berry. I mean, those are the notes I've been going through. I feel like maybe if this coffee had a little bit more depth, I would have experienced it in some earlier days. But for the most part, especially for it being this late, you could definitely still taste what they were going for in this cup of coffee. All right, well, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And obviously take this tasting wheel with a huge grain of salt, as I didn't get to try this coffee until day 73, so there's only so much you can take away from it. But a lot of level 4s. The sweetness at a level 4, it's quite a sweet cup of coffee. The finish at a level 4, yeah, it has a pretty long-lasting sugary finish, which is quite nice, and the cleanliness at a level 4. So I think if this coffee had been drank at an earlier time, we're probably seeing those bumped up even higher. I'm guessing that the sweetness would probably justify itself at a level 5, and the finish at a level 5 as well. However, these are only things I can assume based off of what I'm experiencing today. Cleanliness level 4, I don't know if that might have gone down, but it's a pretty clean cup of coffee in general, so I feel like it definitely justifies level 4. I can't imagine that I would have justified a level 5 at earlier days, but it's entirely possible it could have. So I think keep all of those things in mind. This is, again, a more tame version of what this coffee actually is supposed to be. The berry fruit at a level 4, I imagine that one as well might have also been bumped up to a level 5. And the citrus fruit, which is always where I lump the apple, that one is probably the highest thing on this tasting wheel. I feel like that one could even now still have been all the way up there at that level 5, as that one was quite pronounced and it was a unique apple. I'll say this coffee, it sounds a little suspect to me as somebody that isn't necessarily the biggest fan of the red berries in general. I've alluded to that in so many previous reviews, and not the biggest fan of apple in general. However, they're both such sugary candy-like versions of those fruits that I couldn't help but actually really enjoy the uniqueness of those flavor profiles in this cup of coffee. So I actually didn't mind the very strong apple flavor that was coming from it because it was so unique and it's so sweet. Let's see here, caramel bumped up to a level 3. Yeah, I keep alluding to the candied sweetness that comes from this, a very sugary candied sweetness to it. So that's why the caramel's up there. Body level 2, I would probably bump that up through the AeroPress, but I mean, it's through the AeroPress. I think for the most part, I actually quite like the way that this tasting wheel looks for this coffee and this late into this coffee. I think it's a pretty good representation of what I was experiencing this late into the roast of this coffee. All right, my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one was, I think it kind of lived up to the expectation, especially for how late it is. I'm going to keep alluding to the fact that it's just so late, and that's why this is kind of an unofficial review, because it was a wonderful coffee. It's a very sweet cup of coffee. It has a lot of the things I look for: sweetness, clarity, and fruitiness, and a lot of sugariness to this cup of coffee as well. Very sweet cup of coffee. So for those reasons, it's by far my favorite of Nomad's coffees, and I think that just kind of leads down some interesting thoughts on this. If this coffee is this much better, I mean, there is just so much difference between this coffee and everything else I've had from Nomad. With one exception, I've tried some coffees from the coffee shop that started carrying Nomad's coffees, and I really like their Sidra, their Ecuadorian Sidra, another one of their higher end coffees. There's just a little bit too much of a gap between how much I'm enjoying their higher end coffees and their standard offerings. And I always say that you draw people into the higher end offerings by having some wonderful standard offerings. So it's kind of interesting just how much I really enjoyed this coffee relative to a lot of the other things that Nomad has offered. So I don't really know what to make of it. I don't really know what to make of Nomad in general. So I think, I'm just going to speak really positively about this coffee, as I think that this one was a very nice coffee. And I think the type of person I would suggest this coffee to is somebody that really enjoys their sugary candied fruits, because this has them in such wonderful abundance and they maintain a lot of its clarity as well. So that's just kind of the best way I can direct this review, because I think this just does kind of demonstrate that even if I haven't necessarily been the biggest fan of some of Nomad's coffees, I can see exactly what they were going for in this one, as this one right here I thought was a very nice cup of coffee. I think I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this Red Plum, I would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the El Paraiso Red Plum Processed Colombia from Nomad Coffee. Thank you for watching.